Hello, Fright Family. How's everyone doing today? I hope you're all well. I'm excited to bring you another video designed to help you relax or drift off to sleep with these eerie stories set to calming rain sounds. Before you drift off, let me know in the comments where and when you're tuning in, and if you're enjoying the content. Your feedback means a lot, so if you have any suggestions to make these videos even better, don't hesitate to share. I had been helping out in my family's restaurant for as long as I can remember. Everyone in the family pitched in wherever they could. I'd often do my homework at a table in the back of the dining room after school, while helping out as needed. I didn't mind at all. In fact, I enjoyed taking breaks from my schoolwork to assist with customers. When I was old enough to ride a moped, I even began helping with deliveries. Since we lived in the city, it was pretty convenient, allowing me to make quick deliveries to nearby customers. As I got older, I preferred working during slower hours since I often had more schoolwork to finish. We lived in an apartment above the restaurant, so it varied who was downstairs helping in slower times. Sometimes, if business was really slow, I'd be in the dining room alone, which made for a nice quiet place to focus on my studies. You might expect a snowy day to bring more delivery orders, but in our case, Saturdays were the busiest for deliveries, not Fridays. One Friday evening when I was 14, I arrived at the restaurant just as it began to snow. The forecast on TV hinted at a heavy storm, which we knew would likely keep people away. As the snow built up, my family began going back and forth between our apartment and the restaurant. I had agreed to keep an eye on things downstairs. With the snow coming down hard and no customers around, the restaurant became darker and quieter, a bit surreal with all the snowfall outside. I was deep into my work, not really noticing my surroundings, when suddenly I heard someone enter. I looked up to see a man, probably in his mid-20s, step into the dining room. I was about to get up and offer him a table, but he walked past the host station. For a moment, I thought he might want to order takeout from the counter, but something about him made me hesitate. I couldn't pinpoint why, but his presence made me nervous, so I stayed seated. The man stopped close to my table and looked at me, with a strange smile that only made me more uneasy. Even now, years later, I remember the tension as I sat there waiting for him to speak. When he did, I wish he hadn't, he began making unpleasant remarks, using some harsh language to insult me and my family's background. This was a diverse neighborhood, but he seemed resentful about us running a restaurant here. Finally, realizing I needed help, I moved to get up, planning to run up to the apartment to alert my dad and older brother. I knew they'd be able to handle it. Before I could get up, however, the man quickly reached into his coat and pulled out a knife. I froze in fear, sinking back into my chair. I'd never been confronted with a weapon before, and I didn't know how to respond. I wanted to call out to my family upstairs, but I was too scared to move or speak. I feared he was going to harm me, but I couldn't gather the courage to escape. Sensing my fear, the man continued with his taunts, now focused on my reaction. I couldn't understand why this was happening to me or what I'd done to deserve it. I truly thought I might not make it out unharmed. Just then, something happened that turned everything around. The restaurant phone started ringing. I had told my family I'd watch over things downstairs, and we always answered within the first few rings. I couldn't get up to answer, and I figured the man wouldn't let me, but thankfully, the phone kept ringing. This caught my family's attention upstairs. They knew if I didn't answer, something was likely wrong. Luckily, that's exactly what they suspected. Both my dad and my older brother came downstairs, with my brother bringing his aluminum baseball bat. The man's focus shifted from me to my family, and my dad instructed me to head into the kitchen, which I did immediately. From the kitchen window, I watched my brother take a firm swing with the bat, nearly knocking the man off his feet. Caught off guard by my brother's quick response, the man almost stumbled back. Before my brother could take another swing, the man dashed for the door and ran out into the snowy night. My brother seemed ready to go after him, but my dad called him back, not wanting to risk anyone's safety. After that incident, we never let anyone stay in the restaurant alone again. Nothing like this had ever happened before, so we'd never seen a need for extra precautions. But from then on, at least 2 family members stayed in the dining room, with a self-defense item nearby. Thankfully, we never had to use it. This is a difficult story for me to share for a couple of reasons. First, I was quite young when it happened, so my memory of it isn't the clearest. My parents have retold it over the years to help refresh my memory, though they each remember it a bit differently. The second reason will become clear at the end of the story. When I was 6 years old, I was very close to my mom. I followed her everywhere and always wanted her attention, and I stayed that way throughout her life. At that time, a cousin of mine, named Leo, came to live with us. His parents had recently passed away in a fire. His mother was my mom's sister, so my mom took him in, and with that, things changed a lot. Leo rarely spoke, which I guess is understandable for a kid who had just lost his parents. He used to live in town. I'll keep the location anonymous, but it wasn't in the United States. And we lived in the countryside. He may have had friends back in town that he would play with regularly. But in our rural setting, there were no nearby neighbors, and I was the only kid around for him to play with. However, Leo didn't want to play. He wouldn't go outside with me to climb trees or play board games. He didn't want to play at all. But what he did do was something that really bothered me. Leo was very attached to my mom, which I didn't like. Being close to my mom, I wanted all of her attention, but Leo would follow her around, sometimes even holding on to her skirt as if he didn't want her to leave. When my mom or I tried to get him to stop, he'd start to cry and scream. Everyone agreed it was easier to just let him be, though it made me quite upset. Since I was young and Leo was always with my mom, I started going out into the woods nearby. One day, it was unusually dark with thunderclouds overhead, and I decided to explore. The stormy atmosphere was thrilling, with the sky darkening, the wind blowing, and occasional flashes of lightning and thunder. I don't know how long I was out there, but eventually I realized I didn't know how to get back home. I hadn't paid attention to landmarks, and I didn't know which direction to go. The story of Hansel and Gretel came to mind, but unlike them, I had no trail to follow back. At first, I thought I could simply retrace my steps by walking the same amount of time I had walked out. But the storm kept growing stronger, and it began to feel more intense. I wasn't usually scared of storms, but the thought of being out in one for the first time frightened me. Luckily, despite the dark clouds, it didn't rain. As time went on, I became more anxious. I always thought my grandma was a bit unusual. I never enjoyed visiting her house when I was a kid. She wasn't the typical warm and welcoming grandma who loves having her grandchildren over, baking cookies and all that. My grandma was incredibly particular about her house. She didn't seem to enjoy having kids over, mainly because she was worried we'd break things. It wasn't until I was a teenager that she seemed comfortable with me being there at all. Even then, she had strict rules about not touching anything in her house. No reading her books, no touching her keepsakes, and don't even think about going near her paintings. On some level, I understood. I can't say I ever wanted to be that way myself, but her house was her space, and she had every right to protect it as she saw fit. Still, I hated it. My grandma eventually passed away, and we never really grew close. However, she did leave some of her belongings to each of us. Surprisingly, she willed the house to me. I assumed it was because I was the only one in the family without a home of my own. Along with the house, she also left me her keepsakes, paintings, and books, insisting in her will that I keep them in the home as she had. I appreciated her gesture, but I didn't want all that stuff around. Now that the house was mine, I wanted to make it feel more like my own. So I grabbed some boxes and started packing her things up. I was careful. I wrapped each keepsake in bubble wrap before placing it in the box. Even though I hadn't been close with my grandma and didn't care much for her things, I still wanted to handle them respectfully. There was a large closet near the entryway of the house. I carried the first box over there, ready to store the keepsakes safely. As I opened the closet door and prepared to put the box inside, I suddenly felt uneasy. I looked up, and there, in the closet, was my grandma. She was staring at me with a stern expression and firmly shook her head, no. Then, just as suddenly as she appeared, she vanished. I nearly dropped the box but managed to hold on. I was absolutely terrified. I realized then that I'd seen my grandma's spirit, and she was clearly against me packing her things away. After that, I put her belongings back where they'd been. I still live in the house, and her things are still displayed just as she wanted. I don't dare move them again because I don't want her to return. In grade 11, on a chilly morning, I was on my usual route to school, taking the path that led directly across from the entrance. I remember it vividly. It was just an ordinary day, and I had my backpack slung over one shoulder as I walked. The school building loomed in the distance, with its familiar brick walls and buzzing crowds of students gathering near the entrance. I was lost in my own thoughts, mentally preparing for the day's classes, when, out of nowhere, a woman approached me. She looked at me with a mix of concern and curiosity in her eyes and asked, "Are you lost?" Her question threw me off. I was right across from the school. I was clearly just a student on my way there. I told her, "No, I'm just heading to school." But she didn't seem convinced. Her expression shifted slightly as though she was evaluating whether or not to believe me. A man stood beside her, who I assumed was her husband, and he looked equally concerned. They exchanged glances, and then, almost in unison, they asked if I wanted to go get coffee with them if I was lost. Their offer was strange. It was so out of place that it made me hesitate. Who invites a teenager for coffee just because they might look lost? Again, I explained, "I'm not lost, I'm just going to school," gesturing toward the building only a short distance away. But their insistence lingered, as though they were waiting for me to change my mind. They didn't seem like a threat, and their tone wasn't exactly alarming, but there was an oddness to it that I couldn't shake. I wondered if maybe they mistook me for someone else, or if there was something about the way I looked that made them think I needed help. Looking back on it now, I still wonder why they thought I was lost. I mean, I had a backpack on and was literally across from the school grounds, surrounded by other students arriving for the day. But the strange interaction has stuck with me, leaving me with a lingering curiosity about their intentions. I've often thought about what might have happened if I'd been lost, or if I'd taken them up on their offer for coffee. Was it simply an unusual but harmless encounter, or could there have been something more to it? It's one of those random, small mysteries that stays with you, the kind you can never quite solve, but that leaves you wondering each time you remember it. I worked as a dispatcher for a small ambulance service stationed just outside a fairly large city in the middle of the United States. It was a job that seemed straightforward on the surface, yet every now and then, something truly extraordinary would happen, creating stories we could never forget. One of the strangest and most unsettling experiences I had involved a longtime patient we'll call Susan. She was a dialysis patient, and one of our services was to transport patients who were very unwell or had disabilities to and from these regular dialysis appointments. Susan was in her late 70s and lived with her son, David, who was in his late 40s. They relied on us frequently, so we knew them well. For several months, our crew would pick up Susan like clockwork 3 times a week, delivering her to her appointments and back home again. Everyone knew Susan, whether from the crew members who saw her in person, or from those of us who spoke with her, or her son regularly on the phone. She was part of our routine, a familiar face and name in our schedules. Naturally, any updates about her health were shared among the staff to keep everyone informed, and it wasn't unusual for us to get calls from the crew about how she was doing after each transport. One day, she was feeling particularly unwell, but insisted on going to her appointment regardless. Our crew picked her up, and she made it to the dialysis center. However, during the treatment, she lost consciousness and was taken straight to the hospital for care. When her next dialysis appointment came up, we followed protocol and called the hospital to check on her status. The hospital informed us that Susan was still admitted, but was expected to be discharged the following day, so she would receive her dialysis treatment there rather than needing our transport service. We noted the update and prepared for the next scheduled treatment. When her next appointment arrived, we called the hospital again to see if she had been released. This time, they informed us that she had, in fact, been discharged the previous day. That was good news, but a bit odd. Susan typically arranged for us to be her transport to and from any hospital or medical facility, and this time we hadn't received any request. We shrugged it off as an oversight and decided to call her son, David, to see if she would still need us for her upcoming appointment. He answered and told us she wasn't feeling well enough to attend her treatment, and mentioned he might take her back to the hospital himself. We told him that if they needed us, they could call any time, and we canceled her trip for the day. Another appointment rolled around, and once again, we called David. This time, he informed us that she was back in the hospital. We found it odd that she'd been admitted without our knowledge, especially since her health had been deteriorating. However, we took his word for it, canceled her trip, and moved on. The same thing happened at her next scheduled appointment. David told us Susan was back in the hospital, so we noted it and canceled her trip. When yet another appointment came up, we tried to reach David, but this time he didn't answer our calls, nor did he return them. Given that we had a standing arrangement with Susan to transport her to her dialysis appointments unless told otherwise, we decided to send a crew to her home to collect her for treatment. When the crew arrived at Susan's home, they knocked several times with no answer. Finally, David came to the door, cigarette in hand, and seemed a bit surprised to see them. The crew explained they were there to pick up Susan for her appointment. David looked a bit flustered and mentioned that he had forgotten to call us, but Susan was still in the hospital. The crew extended their best wishes for her recovery, but something felt off. They radioed back to dispatch, letting us know that the situation seemed strange, and suggested we call the hospital David had mentioned to confirm if Susan was still there. When we contacted the hospital, they told us they had no record of Susan being admitted recently. We instructed the crew to leave the scene, but our suspicions were growing. Given the inconsistencies, we called for a welfare check on Susan at David's residence to ensure everything was okay. The rest of the day passed in silence. We received no updates from the police, David, or Susan. The following morning, as I began my shift, the phone rang with an unexpected call from the local sheriff's department. The officer began by saying, "I'm calling to report back on the welfare check you requested yesterday." My heart sank as his tone was serious. I hadn't anticipated a follow-up, much less one that sounded so grim. The sheriff went on to explain that upon arriving at David's home, they spoke with him, and he insisted that Susan was back from the hospital but wasn't feeling well. When the officers requested to see Susan, David eventually agreed and led them inside. The scene they found was unsettling. Susan's lifeless body was propped up on the couch, wrapped in blankets as though she were simply watching TV. But it was apparent she had been dead for some time, likely around 2 weeks, according to their estimation. The officers revealed that, upon questioning David, they learned he had been regularly changing her clothes, continuing his routine as if nothing had happened. It was a bizarre and heartbreaking situation. David was likely grappling with some form of grief or mental distress, but what made the situation so eerie was that he had only started to care for his mother once she was gone. He'd never been especially attentive to her needs while she was alive, according to those who had interacted with him. Yet here he was, preserving her presence as though unable to let go. There was no news coverage, no additional updates from law enforcement, nothing further at all. It was the kind of story that reminds you that extraordinary, often unsettling things can happen right in your own town without anyone ever knowing. It was one of those experiences that stayed with all of us at the station. A somber reminder of the strange, complex ways people sometimes cope with loss. Today, I want to share a childhood story that's both terrifying and hilarious. At least, now that I can look back and laugh. It's a mix of sleepwalking, a midnight visitor, and just enough slapstick comedy to turn a nightmare into one of my favorite stories. Grab your popcorn, because this one's wild. So, picture this. I was about 9 years old, living in Decatur, Georgia, which at the time was a pretty rough area. Now, I had this strange habit of sleepwalking, like hardcore sleepwalking. I'd be night at the museum levels of wandering around, and most mornings I wouldn't even remember what had happened. One night, my mom found me outside on our front lawn, sleeping soundly in my pajamas like it was the most normal thing ever. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, standing somewhere random, totally confused. A few times, I'd even end up outside, staring at the sky or wandering back toward the house, hoping I hadn't accidentally locked myself out. I'd walk up to our door, wide open, by the way, since sleepwalking me didn't exactly have a keen sense of home security, and slip back in, trying not to think too hard about the things that might be lurking around in the dark. So, yeah, my sleepwalking was basically a terrifying adventure on repeat. But then came one night I'll never ever forget. It started like any other night. I don't even remember how I got to the window, but somehow I wake up standing by it, curtains drawn back, and I'm just staring out into the night. We're talking 3 a.m. darkness, the kind that makes everything look like it's hiding something. I have no idea how long I'd been standing there, but suddenly, as I start to actually wake up, I get this weird feeling, like I'm being watched. And that's when I notice someone's looking back at me. Now, this isn't just any someone. No, standing right outside my bedroom window is this massive guy, and he's completely hairless. No hair, no eyebrows, not even a shadow of stubble. Just pale skin, big eyes, and he's slowly inching closer and closer. I can feel my heart hammering in my chest as he leans in, his face getting practically pressed against the glass. And he looks just as bewildered as I am, like he can't quite believe what he's seeing. We're just staring at each other, two strangers, a kid in pajamas and this bald, wide-eyed guy, both of us with faces frozen in shock. For a few seconds, we're both in complete disbelief, eyes locked. And then it hits me. I'm not dreaming. I'm wide awake. And this person is actually there, staring right at me through my window. I lost it. I started screaming at the top of my lungs, totally frozen in place. And in true embarrassing kid fashion, yep, I was peeing down my leg in sheer terror. And here's where things take an unexpected turn. You'd think that would be the worst part, right? Well, it turns out I wasn't the only one in shock. The guy outside? His eyes go as wide as saucers. He lets out this high-pitched scream like I'm the monster. And then he does this weird, stumbling, backward move. I guess he didn't expect me to suddenly come to life, let alone start screaming like a banshee in the dead of night. But it gets better. This guy doesn't just stumble away. He starts doing this full-on action movie duck and roll right there on the grass, mid-scream, like he's dodging invisible bullets or something. And then he bolts, zigzagging down the street in this bizarre pattern, like he's avoiding an ambush. The whole scene is surreal, and I'm standing there, still screaming and frozen, watching him weave his way down the block like a scared rabbit. By now, my mom has woken up and rushed in, probably thinking I've had some terrible nightmare. I'm still half in shock, trying to explain to her that there was a man outside, that it wasn't a dream. She calms me down, and eventually I settle back into bed, heart still racing. In the light of morning, I was half convinced I had imagined it all, until we walked out onto the porch and found something that would confirm the whole thing. There, on the porch, was a screwdriver. There were scratches along the doorframe and marks on the door handle. Proof that my midnight visitor had been trying to jimmy the door open. It wasn't just a strange encounter, it was a real close call. This guy was trying to break in, and I just happened to wake up and scare him off at the right moment. To this day, I get chills thinking about that night. But I'll admit, I can't help laughing now when I think back on it. I still remember the wild look in his eyes when I woke up screaming, like I was the last thing he'd expected to see staring back at him. And that scream of his? Absolutely priceless. He had come to break in, but he ended up getting the fright of his life. And I'll never forget that bizarre duck and roll move, like he thought he was in the middle of some big action scene, dodging bullets as he ran away. I mean, I was the one who woke up to a horror movie, but I think I might have scared him worse. Now, whenever I tell this story, I get chills and still almost pee my pants from laughing when I picture his horrified face, the way he bobbed and weaved down the street, and that final zigzag dash into the darkness. I'll probably never know what he thought he saw that night, but one thing's for sure. He definitely wasn't planning on coming back for another look. This is a story from my time in the Navy, back when I was serving aboard a submarine. We were docked in port one evening, with most of the crew on leave. The few of us who were staying for the night were given a rare opportunity to bring our kids on board for dinner. A small but special treat. So, there we were, sharing a meal with the kids, when an announcement crackles over the 4MC, the submarine's emergency communication system. Suddenly, we hear light smoke in the engine room, quickly followed by report of fire in the engine room. Submarine crews train for emergency responses almost religiously. The moment that announcement came over the system, everyone's instinct kicked in. Within seconds, we were all up and moving to our stations. The commanding officer, CO, was still around but stationed topside. One of our senior enlisted team members, realizing the kids needed to be taken out of the harm's way fast, rounded them up and hustled them toward the forward hatch. Our CO was there, literally catching the kids as our team member lifted them up and out one by one, safely placing them up top. The rest of us headed straight toward the reported fire. As we rushed toward the engine room, I noticed something strange. No one had grabbed an emergency breathing mask. Not one person. Without a second thought, I grabbed as many of those masks as I could carry and followed through the hatch. As we entered the engine room, we were greeted by a haze filling the entire space. But this smoke wasn't like any I'd ever encountered. It didn't have that sharp, acrid smell. Instead, it had a strangely sweet scent. Even tasted faintly sweet in the air. It turned out that one of the oil pumps had burst, spraying the entire back end of the submarine with a fine mist of hydraulic fluid. The oil had turned into a light cloud in the air, creating the illusion of smoke. Now, here's the part that still makes me shiver when I think about it. One of the crew was just about to light a tool for repairs in that same room when the announcement came through. Had that announcement been called just a few seconds later, or if the crew member hadn't heard it in time, there's a good chance the entire engine room could have ignited right then and there. With the atomized oil filling the air, it would have been like stepping into a wall of fire before we even had a chance to react. Thankfully, none of that happened. We secured the area, vented the air, and got to work cleaning the fine layer of oil mist that had settled over every surface. After that, we made sure to repair the pump and double-check the surrounding systems. Thinking back, it was surreal to understand just how close we had come to a totally different scenario. In the end, everyone was safe, and the only real casualty was the extra hours we spent scrubbing down the engine room. It's moments like these that remind you of the unpredictable nature of life aboard a submarine. We were lucky that night, but it's a reminder that in this line of work, preparation and timing can mean everything. I watched from a distance while my grandma and grandpa fished on their lake in the backyard. But one thing confused me. While grandpa cast his line and watched his rod, waiting for the anticipating tug of a fish, grandma's gaze remained fixed across the lake, her head tilted intently towards the dark fringe of woods. I never saw her look at the bobbing lures. She didn't even seem interested in fishing at all. I thought that maybe she just simply enjoyed looking at the trees. But a nagging feeling persisted. There was more to her gaze than a simple love for nature. It was summer break, and I decided to spend it at my grandparents' house in Knoxville, Tennessee. They lived in a 2-story house, recently built in 2018. It connected directly to a lake, with a dock jutting out on the far right side, where my grandpa kept his bass boat. My grandparents were a sweet and quiet couple. They kept to themselves most of the time, living a peaceful life in their little corner of the world. Every summer, though, my visits became a tradition. Grandma's invitation was always an automatic yes, her warm smile and gentle voice a beacon calling me back. There were countless things to love about my grandma, her kindness and generosity at the top of the list. If I wanted something, it was usually an automatic yes from her, too. But one of the things I truly cherished most was her stories. Unlike Grandpa, who mostly stuck to tales of his time in the military. Exciting stories filled with bravery and adventure, of course. Grandma was a bottomless well of stories. Whether it was a funny story from her childhood, a heartwarming story about a kind neighbor, or a fantastical bedtime story that transported me to magical lands, Grandma always had one on hand. She was one of those special grandmas who could weave a story from thin air, her words painting vivid pictures in my mind. Grandpa, on the other hand, was a man of few words. A quiet strength emanated from him, and the stories he did tell were always about his service. He'd talk about the places he'd been, the challenges he'd faced, and the lessons he'd learned. While not as fantastical as Grandma's stories, they held a different kind of magic, a testament to his resilience and the experiences that shaped him. One of the things I always admired about Grandpa was his outdoor skills. He'd tell me most of his knowledge came from his military training, jokingly saying they prepared him for anything. He was a true outdoorsman, the kind of person I'd trust implicitly if we were ever lost in the wilderness. He knew everything about fishing, the best spots on the lake, the best techniques to catch different types of fish. Some of my favorite memories were spent on his boat, cutting through the cool morning water, the sun rising over the horizon, and the gentle hum of the motor a comforting lullaby. Every night, Grandma dipped into her seemingly endless well of stories. I never quite understood how she did it. Her mind was like a sprawling library, shelves overflowing with stories to tell. One night, she'd tell me a story of brave knights seeking vengeance, their swords gleaming in the sun. Another night, she'd tell me a story of a land shimmering with magic spells and cursed lands. Then there were the scary stories. Now, Grandma usually avoided them. She knew how they affected me. But the thing about those stories was the detail. Oh man, the detail. They were so vivid, so real. It felt like I was peeking through a crack into another world. A world where the monsters and creatures she described lurked. A world so terrifying that I felt like falling through that crack would kill me. Every night was the same routine. Nestled under a patchwork quilt in the guest room, I'd wait with bated breath. The soft click of the doorknob was my cue. Grandma, her face etched with a lifetime of stories, would enter, a gentle smile gracing her lips. She'd pull up a rocking chair, its rhythmic creak adding to the lullaby effect. Then, in a warm voice, she'd begin telling me a story. One night, though, tucked under the patchwork quilt, I waited for Grandma's nightly visit. The soft click of the doorknob announced her arrival. "Ready for another story?" she asked, her voice a warm rumble. I nodded eagerly. Nights at Grandma's were journeys to magical lands, each story more thrilling than the last. But tonight, I craved a different kind of story, a different kind of excitement. "Can you tell me a scary story tonight, Grandma?" I blurted out. A flicker of surprise crossed her face, followed by a thoughtful pause. Unlike her usual repertoire of action-packed adventures, her stories have always steered clear of scary ones. She sat beside me on the patchwork quilt, her usual mischievous eyes replaced by a thoughtful gaze. Her eyes flickered towards the window for a moment before returning to me. Then, with a gentle smile, she began. "Those woods outside your window," she started, her voice a warm rumble. I instinctively glanced towards the window, the familiar silhouette of the trees outlined across the lake. "There's something in those woods," she continued, her voice dropping to a hushed whisper. A shiver danced down my spine, though the room remained pleasantly warm. Those simple words made me so uncomfortable that I was tempted to just tell Grandma to stop, but the truth was I was hooked. Grandma did tell me scary stories on rare occasions, but they were always fictional, completely disconnected from the real world. She continued, "Every 7 years, it comes out of those woods, it emerges, a creature that's been on this earth for thousands of years. It crawls on all fours. It hunts, a silent predator searching for its prey. I began to tense up a little. The room remained quiet, but the air felt heavy. "Its body is like a man, but twisted and contorted," she murmured, "and its limbs elongated, reaching out at odd angles. Its skin is black as coal, making it difficult to spot during the night." I swallowed hard, my eyes instinctively drawn back to the window. The trees, once comforting, now seemed to writhe with unseen shadows. "But the worst part," she continued, her voice barely a tremor, "is its eyes, multiple eyes, scattered across its head like a spider. They pierce the darkness, searching for an unsuspecting victim," she continued, her voice a hushed whisper, sending shivers down my spine. "Sometimes, if it has trouble finding prey, it ventures closer to houses, searching for unlocked windows." My breath caught in my throat. The image of eyes peering through the glass sent a jolt of terror through me. "If it finds an opening," she murmured, "it will crawl inside and snatch the closest person to it, dragging them back to the woods." I squeezed my eyes shut, the warmth of the quilt a poor barrier against the sudden chill. "It keeps its victims alive for 7 long years," she whispered, "feeding off them slowly until the hunger returns and it's time to hunt once more." My grip tightened on the blanket, and my knuckles were white. A cold sweat was dripping down my skin. "But don't you worry," she said, her voice gentling. "As long as we keep the windows locked, we'll be safe. And don't forget to do the same at your mom's house." She rose from the quilt, her smile strained at the edges. A smile meant to reassure, but one that couldn't hide the sliver of unease in her eyes. Her movement seemed slow and deliberate as she walked towards the window. My eyes followed her, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. She stared out of the window for a moment, as if checking to make sure the thing wasn't around, and then she checked to make sure the window was locked. Just as she was about to turn away, I blurted out, unable to contain the question that had lodged itself in my throat. "Grandma, have you ever seen it?" She paused for a few moments, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her face before a reassuring smile crept onto her lips. She didn't answer me. She simply leaned down and kissed my forehead, a gesture filled with a strange intensity. "Good night, darling," she whispered. Then, with a gentle click, she shut my door behind her. I was awake for most of that night, staring at the darkened window pane. The familiar silhouette of the woods outside now held a new kind of terror. I kept wondering if I would see that face my grandma described, a face with multiple eyes staring back at me. Eventually, exhausted from fear and lack of sleep, my eyelids drifted shut, and I finally drifted off. While I slept, I dreamt of its form shifting and writhing in the darkness. I ran, my legs pumping, but it was like I was running on ice. Panic seized me as the figure lunged, its long arms wrapping around my legs. It dragged me, a rag doll, through the grass, the stench of damp grass filling my nostrils. The woods grew bigger as the thing dragged me there, its jagged edges threatening to devour me whole. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Just as the branches of the trees were about to engulf me, I jolted awake, gasping for breath. Light streamed through the window, painting familiar shapes on the ceiling. The room held a peaceful. It took several deep breaths to slow the pounding of my heart. Relief washed over me, chasing away the lingering dread. Since that night, despite Grandma's steady stream of new stories, the creature in the woods has remained a constant shadow in the corner of my mind. Thankfully, the nightmares, those terrifying chases through endless woods, didn't last. Slowly, the story faded from memory. A few years later, A different kind of darkness descended upon our family. Cancer, a cruel, selfish thief, stole my grandmother's health bit by bit. She fought for months, but in the end, the disease won. It left a hole in our lives, especially for Grandpa. Now, he lives alone, the silence of the house heavy with her absence. Talking about her seems to bring a fresh wave of pain, etched deep into the lines on his face. Sometimes he murmurs about just waiting for his turn to join her. It's a heartbreaking sight. A man transformed into a solitary figure, simply waiting to die. That year was a blur of grief, a dark tunnel we all had to navigate. But with the love and support of family and friends, we eventually managed to pull through. With each passing year, the grief lessened, but Grandma's memory remained. Then, after another few years, during my senior year in high school, something happened. I walked into the house after a long day. The familiar scent of an empty house greeted me. Mom had already left for work. Pulling my backpack onto my bed, I pulled out my books and settled in for an evening of homework, studying, and the occasional break to watch TV. I shut off the TV, changed into my pajamas, and crawled into bed. Sleep, however, remained elusive. My mind was a tangled mess, tossing and turning over the events of the day. Finally, I peeked at the clock on my desk, its green glow reading almost 3 a.m. Just then, a sound shattered the silence, a sharp tap that echoed through the room. My eyes flew open, snapping towards the window. A wave of ice washed over me, freezing my blood solid. Memories of Grandma's story flooded back, the creature, the woods. There, pressed against the glass, was a form that blocked most of the moonlight from filtering in. If not for the sliver of moonlight peeking in around what was blocking it, I wouldn't have been able to see it at all. Its human-shaped body pressed against the window, and across its head, I could have sworn I saw movement, a flicker, like multiple tiny insects scurrying across its flesh. Then, a horrifying realization dawned on me. They weren't insects, they were eyelids. Eyelids flickering open and shut, scanning my room with frantic urgency. My breath hitched. Was this a dream? Just then, a shadowy limb, long and impossibly thin, snaked out towards the base of my window. Had I locked the window? The sickening sound of the window, as the glass began to slide up, hit my ears. Terror choked and screamed in my throat. There are woods behind my mom's house too, and a sickening realization dawned on me. This wasn't just a story, it was real, and it was here. Adrenaline surged through me, and my flight or fight responses kicked in. I threw myself out of bed in a desperate scramble. My feet pounded the floor as I bolted towards the door, flinging it open, but my escape was cut short. The door slammed shut in my face, the force of it throwing me backward. A strangled cry escaped my lips as a wave of terror washed over me. My body locked up, and every muscle seized in a silent scream. Somehow, it was now in my room, that fast. It was no longer at the window. It was now above me, above my door. One of its grotesquely long limbs, tipped with a hand like a spider's claw, pressed firmly against the door, pinning me inside. Another seemed contorted at an unnatural angle, its fingers splayed against the wall in a grotesque parody of a grip. The head, if you could call it that, twisted on its neck in a way that defied human anatomy, almost spinning completely around. A chorus of eyes locked onto me. Trapped and alone, I stumbled back, my mind scrambling for any flicker of hope. The second floor was an escape route, but a leap out the window would likely result in injury, leaving me in a vulnerable position. Besides, that's where it probably wanted me. Right next to the door stood my wooden baseball bat. In a desperate lunge, I grabbed it, the wood rough against my grip. With a yell, I swung the bat with all my strength, connecting with a sickening thud. Splinters of wood rained down as the impact sent a tremor through the room. The creature recoiled slightly, its multiple eyes flickering in what might have been surprise. But the silence that followed was the most unsettling part. No roar of pain, no growl. This thing moved with an unnatural quiet. Even as it moved, it made no noise. It descended to the floor, its grotesque form dwarfing the space in my room. As it loomed closer, lowering its body in a predatory crouch, I swung the mangled bat wildly. The bat connected, with a bone-crunching impact, sending more shards of wood flying through the air. The creature recoiled, its grotesque form momentarily faltering. Seizing my chance, I bolted past the thing, flung open the bedroom door, and slammed it shut behind me with a resounding bang. Adrenaline pumping, I raced down the stairs, each step echoing in the sudden silence. Reaching the living room, I fumbled for the light switch, illuminating the space with a warm glow. Panting, I gripped the broken bat like a lifeline. Its splintered end pointed towards the top of the stairs, towards the thing in my room. Suddenly, a new sound pierced the tense silence. The creak of the front door opening. A silhouette emerged from the doorway, the dim porch light casting long shadows across her face. "There you are." My mom's voice, laced with exhaustion. "What the hell are you?" The sentence died on her lips, completely cut short. Her eyes widened, but neither she nor I had time to react. In a sharp and quick moment, a shadowy, distorted limb, tipped with a spidery claw, shot out, wrapping around my mother's waist. It snagged her, sinking its talons deep into her flesh, a sickening tear echoing in the sudden silence. A strangled noise bubbled in her throat, cut short before it could form a scream. But then I heard her scream fully formed as the thing dragged her away to the woods. I ran with all my effort, but the thing was fast, too fast. All I could do was keep running, watching, as my mom screamed with her arms folded around the creature's arm in a desperate attempt to escape. It had her, though, exactly where it wanted her, out in the open. I fell face first into the grass, a sob wrenching its way out of my chest. Warm tears streamed down my face, blurring my vision as I watched in horror. Mom's screams turned into blood-curdling shrieks, fading into a horrifying silence as they disappeared into the indistinguishable maw of the woods. The police came, but what could they do? What could I tell them? I told them exactly what I saw. They looked at me like I was crazy, but what else could I say? For hours, I sat in a sterile interrogation room, the harsh overhead light blurring my vision. They questioned me over and over, dissecting my story, searching for inconsistencies. But all I could do was repeat the horrifying scene, my voice cracking with each retelling. There was no evidence to tie me to my mom's disappearance. Nothing but my frantic pleas and the raw terror etched onto my face. Finally, they seemed to reach a reluctant roadblock. With a sigh and a dismissive glance, they released me. Now, a search party combs the backyard, venturing into the dense woods behind our house. Bloodhounds sniff the damp earth, their mournful howls echoing through the trees. In my room, the silence pressing down on me like a physical weight. As the harsh light of dawn breaks, I stare at the window. A large handprint, a grotesque splayed imprint of multiple fingers, clings to the outside of the glass. A cold realization settles over me. Now I know that at least one of my grandma's stories is real. I still remember that night vividly. I was just 11 years old, a kid who was still trying to figure out the world, and that night I found out just how frightening it could be. I was home alone for the first time, a milestone that felt like a rite of passage. My mom had gone out for a quick errand, and I had just settled into bed, the comforting weight of my blankets wrapping around me like a hug. I was still on that cusp between childhood and the responsibilities that would come with growing up. The house was quiet, and the only sounds were the gentle hum of the ceiling fan and the occasional creaks of the old house settling. It wasn't long before I drifted off to sleep, but just as I started to relax, I was jolted awake by the unmistakable sound of someone trying to break in through the front door. My heart raced as I lay there, frozen in fear, my mind racing with thoughts I could barely process. Was it my imagination? Or was someone really trying to get in? The noise grew louder, and panic surged through me. I quickly grabbed my phone, my small hands trembling as I dialed 911. My voice shook as I whispered my address, telling the operator that someone was trying to break into my home. After I hung up, instinct kicked in. I knew I had to find a place to hide. I scrambled off my bed, my heart pounding in my chest, and slipped into the pantry. It was dark and cramped, and I squeezed myself into the bottom shelf, trying to make myself as small as possible. I could hear the sound of the front door being rattled and kicked, a sound that echoed through the stillness of the house, sending chills down my spine. My breath felt shallow, and every sound seemed magnified in the silence that followed. Then I heard footsteps moving away from the front door and toward the side of the house, and dread washed over me. They were trying to break into the door next to the pantry now. I held my breath, hoping they wouldn't find me, praying that the police would arrive soon. The thought of being discovered filled me with a paralyzing fear I had never known before. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the noise and focus on my breathing. Minutes felt like hours, and I couldn't tell if it was my imagination or if I really heard the police sirens in the distance. Then I heard the sound of a door being kicked in, followed by voices, shouting, ordering someone to get on the ground. Relief washed over me. Help had finally arrived. The footsteps in the house stopped, and I held my breath, listening intently. Soon after, one of the officers came into the pantry area. I couldn't see him, but I could hear the calm, authoritative tone of his voice as he called out, trying to reassure me. "Hey there, kiddo, it's okay, we're the police. You're safe now." I was still too scared to move or respond, but when he spotted me crouched in the corner, he quickly came over and gently picked me up. The officer held me tightly, his warm presence a stark contrast to the fear that had enveloped me moments before. I felt his strength and kindness as he cradled me, and for the first time since it all began, I felt a flicker of safety. He made sure I felt secure as he spoke softly, asking if I was okay and if I needed anything. I clung to him, not wanting to let go, as if he were my lifeline in a terrifying sea. My heart was still racing, but knowing I wasn't alone anymore provided a sense of comfort. Finally, my mom arrived, her worried face a mix of relief and panic as she rushed into the house. The officer gently set me down, and I rushed to her, wrapping my arms around her tightly. I couldn't help but cry, the emotions of fear and relief crashing over me in waves. The officer stood nearby, ensuring I felt safe before heading out to assist in the situation. I was forever grateful for his kindness that night. That experience changed something in me. I was only 11, but I had tasted fear in a way that most kids my age never had to. I never stayed home alone much after that. The thought of being by myself in a quiet house filled me with anxiety. Even as I grew older, the memory of that night lingered in the back of my mind, a shadow that never quite disappeared. Fast forward to my adult life. When the day finally came for me to sign a lease for my first apartment, I felt a mix of excitement and anxiety. I wanted my own space, but I also didn't want to face the solitude that had haunted me for years. So, I made a decision. I got a dog. I chose a loyal companion who would be there to keep me company and protect me. The moment I brought my dog home, I felt an immense sense of relief. It was like I had finally taken back control over my life. Now, as I sit here at 27, I can reflect on that harrowing night with a sense of understanding. It was a traumatizing experience that shaped my childhood and influenced my choices as an adult. I learned the importance of safety, the value of companionship, and the strength that can come from vulnerability.